Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the True North podcast. I'm your host, Benedict Rhodes. Harness racing, for those who may not be familiar with it, is a form of horse racing in which standard-bred horses race around a track, pulling a driver behind them in a cart called a sulky. Some people often liken it to chariot racing. The fact that you may not be familiar with the sport is the very reason for this episode. Joining me today is Nick Barnsdale, a reporter for Harness Link, to discuss the reasons for the pretty dramatic decline in the sport's popularity over the past several decades, and what can potentially be done to start getting people back to the tracks once again. We'll discuss all of that and more here on the True North podcast. Very excited to be joined by Nick Barnsdale of Harness Link. Nick, how's it going?
Pretty good, Ben. Glad to be joining the world famous True North podcast. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thanks. Always a pleasure to speak with you.
Of course.
Let's just start off on a more broad note. It's the start of the harness racing season in a lot of parts of Canada, or will be coming up very soon. How exciting is that for you, knowing that the season's just right around the corner?
Yeah, it's pretty cool. We're about to start seeing some of the 2-year-olds start racing in the next couple months, which is always what a lot of people look forward to. Some of the great 2-year-olds returning as 3-year-olds for like the biggest stakes. The biggest stakes are typically for 3-year-olds. Um, so that's pretty exciting. You get to see kind of last year's stars come back, and sometimes the dynamics shift. For example, Bulldog Hanover, which some people may have heard of. He actually at 3 he was good, but he wasn't amazing, and then at 4 he had probably the best season in harness racing history. So um yeah, to see those horses come back, it's pretty exciting. And also, we're having a lot more tracks open up soon. A little more workload for me, but yeah, overall it's the summer is when the sport really shines.
And I know you cover races all over the world, so it's not really an off season per se. But how special is it, to know that soon you'll be walking into Woodbine or walking into a track for the first time this season? How exciting is that?
Well, it is fun when you get to go and cover those big events. Like, I don't always go to the track to cover my races, but for events like the Camelot Classic over at London, and the North America Cup, which I think is first couple weeks of June this year, it is pretty cool to go in and see the atmosphere, like see a bunch of people there, and it's like, yeah, this is what it was like during its heyday. And now it's only a couple of days a year, but it is still cool when you go there and you see a bunch of people and there's a buzz and special events going on. So that'll be fun.
And you and I know each other well, but for the people listening to the podcast who maybe don't know you so well, maybe tell us about your background in the sport. Like I know your dad's and your parents are both very interested in the sport. Your dad's a prominent harness racing journalist as well. How special is that to bond with them over that, and how far back, I guess, does your family history go in the sport?
Well, it only really goes back to my dad's dad, who was a big um, horse racing guy, big gambler, of course. And he brought my dad to the track when he was a young kid, and then that cycle kind of. I mean, my dad's dad passed away when he was like, I think 16 or something, but my dad has brought me to the track basically since I was a little kid. Like, you can actually see a picture of him holding me as an infant, and he has a quite tenuous grasp on me, and a quite firm grasp on the racing form in his other hand. And then there's another picture of me as a young kid when I still had very curly hair, sitting in the stands, I think at Mohawk Racetrack with a program, looking at all the horses. So, I've been going to the track and definitely not betting since I was a young kid. And so that's kind of my experience. Like, I've seen some great horses, some somewhat notable names like Some Beach Somewhere, and Admiral's Express was a pretty famous one, and Sandpail I was heavily involved in, and that was a probably the last really big horse that people got very excited about. Like, I don't think, with the exception of Queen's Play Day, like Sandpail, you won't hear the crowd at Woodbine any louder. And obviously, they don't have harness racing there anymore. But yeah, that's kind of how far back I go. And then back in 2018, when I just graduated high school and I was going into the journalism program with the very famous Benedict Rhodes, I might add. Um, I got my first piece published in Down the Stretch newspaper. Shout out to Peter Gross, and it kind of took off from there. Like, I got more opportunities, and then for my internship, I was offered a job with Harness Link, which is probably the only site that has dedicated coverage from basically each continent except, I guess, South America. Um, so it is quite cool to have continued that tradition. Like my dad actually went to Humber as well and graduated from the journalism program, the diploma program. But he actually didn't get a writing job until around 2013, so probably around like 30 years after he graduated. And it started with a blog that he did for free, and then it slowly grew, and he actually won our award for written media excellence a couple of years ago. So I guess it is kind of cool to be continuing the lineage in that sense, and yeah, it is cool to be able to share that with my dad.
And you mentioned a couple names of horses there. Which ones are you kind of looking forward to watching, I guess, in this 2023 season?
Well, the upcoming season, yeah, there are some interesting ones at two that are coming back, and some good ones at three that are coming back at four that will have to go now into the open to face horses. Unfortunately, we did lose Bulldog Hanover to retirement last season. Maybe phrased that a bit wrong, but yeah, he retired after probably one of the best seasons ever. I mean, there were a lot of talented horses last year, and I can't really pinpoint one I'm super looking forward to, but we had a couple Canadian horses that won uh, our divisional awards, like awards for their specific age, sex, and gait that were pretty close in the Breeders' Crown, which is maybe some people watching have heard of the Breeders' Cup, and it's basically our version of that. And so it is pretty exciting when you have those horses that were, first of all, stars in Ontario in our own what's called the Sire Stakes, which is simply if a sire is in Ontario, then you qualify for these rich races. And those horses, Adair Castle and Silver Label, are pretty exciting, especially because they've already started the season quite well in smaller stakes races right here in Ontario over at Mohawk Racetrack in Campbellville. So those are two exciting ones. My dad has a few young horses that are coming up that he owns like a couple percentage points of them. So that'll be fun to watch them make their debuts at two. But yeah, that's what I'd say I'm excited about for the season.
Definitely. And the main reason I wanted to have on this show is talk about your thesis project. For those who've listened to the show before, you probably heard me talk about my thesis project. But first of all, why don't you just, I guess, explain a bit what the project actually was and what sort of compelled you to write it?
So the main reason I investigated this, I did this article, which is about the decline of harness racing in North America, is because I've always heard the stories of people in harness racing essentially talking about the golden days, talking about how the stands used to be packed and how people would line up out the door for big race days, and they used to have these grand contests, and it sounded so opulent, like they got to do so many different things, and they basically had, a lot of the market share in terms of North American sports, and they had almost all of it in terms of betting, especially in Canada. We didn't have anything, and there was no other legal form of gambling. I think there's one that I'm forgetting, but basically, other than horse racing, there was nothing you could legally bet on until I think the early 80s. I think 1981 was when we had our first casino. So basically, if you wanted to bet on something, you had to go to the track. And um, since the peak, the attendance at Canadian harness racing tracks from the data that I was able to gather was in 1979 at around 9.5 million people attending the races in the course of a year. And the most recent data from 2005 was about 3.7 million people attending the track each year, which is obviously, far. Oh, sorry, that's yeah. So far lower. And of course, I'm almost certain if you extended the data to 2023, you would see even more significant decline because, I mean, just if you go to the track, you're not going to see that many people. And so there's a huge difference from what I see and what people talk about from, people that were around in the 80s and 90s, what they saw there, and probably a even crazier figure is that in the US, and I wasn't able to collate the wagering data for Canada due to some discrepancies, but in the US, and I'm sure the numbers are very similar here, wagering from all sources went up from 1946, which is the first data point collected, from around 1.75 billion for the whole country to around 15 billion in the mid 70s. And this is, of course, inflation adjusted. Um, and so now today, which is obviously the basis for the rest of the inflation adjusted numbers, is back down below $2 billion. So it's been an insane crash of almost, I think, more than 80% of the wagering since its heyday. So knowing that and hearing all these stories, I really wanted to look at why this happened, because I've heard various people talk about, what they think it is, but I thought it would be interesting to actually do a deep dive, because as far as I knew there wasn't any other really in-depth not investigative, but in a sense comprehensive articles on the topic, and I tried to be as comprehensive as possible, in essentially taking a look into why harness racing went from a staple almost in American and Canadian cultures to something that most people of our age don't know exists.
Yeah, definitely some damning numbers, and we'll get into more of those as the show goes on. But the title of your thesis is where did everybody go? And you said that some of those numbers are not the most positive ones, of course. And how do people in the industry react to your story? And what kind of feedback did you get from people within the sport?
I was actually somewhat surprised that it was pretty much overwhelmingly positive. In harness racing, because it's an industry that is so um, weak right now and so under threat, I think we have a tendency to be quite defensive to any sort of criticism, and especially among the administrative bodies and the executives in the industry, there tends to be negative reaction to anything that could be construed as critical of the industry, or even presenting facts of the industry that are unfortunately negative. And that carries on to general fans, practitioners within the industry, drivers, trainers, owners, whatever. But the response to this was almost overwhelmingly positive. I only got a few pieces of criticism, which I think were actually quite valid. But most of it was people saying, this is a great read. This is an important piece. We need to identify the problems and things like that. And I did have a few people also contributing their own thoughts, like on social media, responding to the article and basically saying, well, I think it was this. I think this. I think maybe the article could have discussed this. And it was all either quite positive or quite constructive. So I think the response was great. I mean, I haven't seen any action based on my article, and my article isn't prescriptive either. It wasn't meant to be like this is what we need to do. It was more of a let's look at our history, and let's look at the sad things that no one really talks about that much. And so I think from that angle, I think it was quite positive. I did get, as of last check, around 4,000 views on it, which is pretty great. It's in the top 0.1% of all harness link articles, I think. So I'm quite happy with that.
And we'll get more into the specifics in just a second here. But through your research, did anything really surprise you, or anything really catch you off guard when you were doing your reporting for this?
I mean, well, first of all, I was actually surprised that I was able to get data. Um, Someone, I believe it's Ann Chunko from the USTA, the United States Trotting Association, was very helpful, and she actually went through and scanned all of the all of what's called the trotting and pacing guides going back to 1946 for me, and that was just incredible. And that was not the other thing that surprised me was actually the results from the data. um like the graph is, it's staggering to look at how vertical it went, and then how vertical it went the other way, over the course of about 80 years. So the data was very quite stunning to look at, to see the decline of the industry actually represented in a graph and in numbers, because I don't think I've never seen anyone do that before. I've never seen people collect this data and publish it. So I think also that was one of the strengths of my article, was this is something people really haven't seen before. People usually talk about it in the abstract, like, oh, I remember when people were climbing over each other at Yonkers, and you know 10,000 people came on a Monday night at Mohawk. But to actually quantify it was, I think, something that surprised me at my ability to do with help, but also what the results of that were. I think another thing that surprised me was also the number of varied responses that I got. there were some people that did have, similar responses, but other people that said basically quite different reasons for the industry, and a bunch of different perspectives. Like when I talked to Ryan Clements for my piece, I know we'll get into specifics later, but he had various different perspectives, and he was very knowledgeable about some of the infrastructure industry and how that has kneecapped us. And I say us because, as I said before, the industry is very tight knit, and we kind of view ourselves almost as a community, even in a sport which is entirely based upon trying to beat each other for money. Um, so that surprised me, and also what surprised me is how quite open people were about it. Like I think I was somewhat expecting some of the sources I contacted to say, I don't know, I don't think there's really a decline at all. Like I would disagree. I think if look at this race day, look at this track, look at this photo, and you know and deny it. But I didn't really get a lot of that. I got one driver trainer who said, I think it's inevitable that it'll bounce back, which personally I disagree with. I don't think it's inevitable at all. I think it will really be a struggle in the future to fight back for relevance. But, I did get a lot of people who gave me basically quite open and honest and, brutally, bluntly stated opinions, which was great. So yeah, I would say the fact that I was able to get this data and collate it was really cool and a bit surprising, and also the fact that I did get some very truthful and realistic answers from the people that I contacted.
You mentioned just now being brutally honest, and I know one of the first lines in your story is, "Many people have watched their life's greatest passion become an afterthought in the public sphere." How often is that kind of thing brought up if you're at a track or talking to people in the industry? How often are people talking about that, or is it just kind of a new reality almost, where it's kind of just the thing you don't speak about?
Um, no, I think people do talk about it in more of a reminiscent tone. Like, oh man, I remember back when, there used to be 20,000 people coming to Yonkers on a Monday night. Or, back when it's like, man, we used to have these really cool events that we just don't have anymore because there's no money. Or even people talking about, man, I missed that track that closed down. I mean, I talked to Rick Ciron, who is originally from Quebec and who started his career at Blue Bonnets. And, he said I wasn't expecting that sort of decline. And he talked about how he missed the people and the food most of all. And, he moved to Mohawk, I think he said in the late 90s or early 2000s. And yeah, I mean, you do get a lot of people reminiscing about, all the things they missed from back in the day. Um, and so people do talk about it, and people do quite often like to discuss what's wrong with the industry. Typically, it's what's plaguing it today rather than what happened to cause it to fail back in the 70s. But it also was somewhat of a gradual decline. So while there are imminent threats to the industry today and things that have happened over the past 10 years, such as the ending of the slots at racetracks program, it was kind of gradual in the sense that it was never a sudden thing. It was never like it was funnily enough, in contrast to the title of the piece, I don't think there were people that suddenly woke up one day and asked, where did everybody go? I think, it is a thing we can ask now when you reflect on it, but it was quite gradual. And if you look at the graph, it does look somewhat like a very steep mountain, but if you really think about it, this is something that people have witnessed over 5 or so decades. So it has been pretty long, and there have been people that have seen it all. But yeah, that's kind of thing. Like it is talked about. There are people who will just sit back and reminisce, and there are people who will talk about what the problems are, or like think back and say like, man, when the government took the funding away, that was a killer, or when we enacted this policy, that was a problem. So I wouldn't say it's super taboo, but it also isn't really everyday conversation, I guess.
And you said a couple minutes ago that you don't think a swift U-turn is really inevitable. You think it's something that's going to take time to bring it back on the upswing. Um, we're saying the sports maybe in decline or not as popular as it once was, but in Ontario, it's still $1 billion industry. Uh, does that give you hope that people are still investing and hopefully we'll be able to go back on the upswing?
I think it's really tough, and it is hard to predict the future, as most people will tell you, because one thing that makes the existence of the industry very tenuous is the fact that it is reliant almost entirely on government funding. If tomorrow the Ontario government said you're getting nothing more, then all tracks but one, I would assume, would close down within probably a year. And that's the thing. So the government has given Ontario Racing this funding under the assumption that we're going to do something with it. And Ontario Racing, which is the body that administers this funding to tracks in Ontario and programs and all this, has to give them progress reports. And I think, if we don't see progress, that funding could drastically reduce or disappear. And we could reach levels of impending catastrophe like we saw with the ending of the Slots at Racetracks program in 2013. So I think also a main threat is that it is a very old consumer base for the most part. Like there are young guys like me and, a few, but for the most part, the people that are keeping it alive are in the older demographic, 50s, 60s, 70s, like my dad, who's in his late 50s now. And that's another threat. And I think if we don't do something drastic to make it appealing to a broad range of people, then it will be, it could be curtains, in the next 3 or so decades. So I think my idea, which I haven't really spoken to many people about, but my idea is that it has to become more of an entertainment product, uh, like the NFL, NBA, professional sports. Because if you go to the track, you know, most people don't have a favorite horse or driver or trainer that they cheer for. They might say like, "Oh yeah, I like this guy," but people aren't showing up to come watch them. People aren't showing up to just cheer for them. So I think what we should, and we do have some of the infrastructure for implementing a system that makes it so that it is plausible for people to show up and have something to root for, because like most people have a favorite sports team. Most people don't just watch it for the kicks. And I mean, if like, I'll be the first to admit I would rather watch an NFL game than go to the track and just watch racing if I'm not betting on it, right? So I think what it has to be is a complete shift in the product. The betting is the main source of revenue, and as we said, like it has collapsed by about 80% since the mid 70s. And I think what has to happen is the business model has to shift to, jersey sales, whatever the three sources of income um for example, European football clubs, which is match day, um ticket sales, I think. And I can't remember the three, which is awkward because I brought up this example, but you know what I mean, concessions, things like that. And because it isn't really a revenue stream at the moment. So, and I do think we already keep standings for things like the Grand Circuit, which is our biggest races. We already keep standings for that stuff. And it's like we could so easily change the marketing to just make it more of a thing like, your guy from Ohio is killing it out there. Ron Burke, the best trainer of all time. He's on top in the Grand Circuit standings, and try to get people to become fans, or even take more structural changes, like trying to make this thing into a thing that's more like the North American sports, like have a defined start and end to the season, have rosters, like say, okay, you're a stable now, you have to lock in 10 horses, a trainer and a driver, and you're going to have these set race dates that you go for points, and get people to come out and support these teams rather than come out and make $2 bets on horse racing. Like, I think that's the way to go. I mean, it would be easy, and like I said, it would be a lot of work, and there would be a lot of resistance to something like that. Um, but yeah, I think without some kind of a drastic change, the outlook is very bleak, especially considering we had another thing that speaks to the decreased relevance of it is that apparently the the association that ran racing in New Brunswick at Exhibition Park apparently offered enough of a lease rental fee to keep the land at Exhibition Park for the track and keep it profitable for the place that actually owns it. And they declined. They said, "We don't want you here anymore." And so that's the thing, like when your lease is getting declined for non-monetary reasons, like that's a scary thing. And so I think with the decreased relevance, with the decreased revenue, and revenue has held steady over the last few years, I will say that. But with decreasing revenue and decreasing public care for the thing, and as let's face it, as our core consumer base dies, things are not going to get better. So I think it needs to be some kind of structural change to the product that can appeal to more people.
And what about, in the sense of like people, like families, for example, might want to go to a soccer game or go to a baseball game. What kind of things can horse racing do to attract those people to come to harness racing? And what kind of unique things does harness racing have that other sports don't have?
Well, like I said, like you could make it into an actual team thing where people will show up to support their stable, like they do show up to support their football team, basketball team. But I think harness racing could also have a lot more things to appeal to a broader audience. Like I think you could give away free bets, you could have more involvement from the drivers, you could do barn tours, which have all been tried, but not it's not super common. And I think if you made it into more of an event, which they actually are trying to do at a new track in Manitoba, then I think you could get more people on board and come not just for the races, because the races happen, they last for less than 2 minutes and they happen every 20 minutes. And it's like there's so much downtime. So I think you have to do things like that and have more of a presentation. Like I said, I still think with these types of things, it won't move the needle all that much. I hope it would, but you know, the other thing is to increase betting. Like betting is our main source of revenue, and there's a lot of options for betting. Like we don't have prop bets. Like so much of the revenue on sports betting is prop bets and things like that. We don't have that in Canada. We have one carrier of harness racing, of racing in general, that has a monopoly on wagering. And it's like, it's a good platform. It allows you for all the basic harness racing bets, but they're not doing anything innovative. They're not allowing same card parlays, prop bets, even like who's going to be the leading driver this track, no future bets. So I think there's a lot more we could also do on the betting front to appeal to people and try to get some more market share from the sports betting places.
And you mentioned, that's kind of leads to my next question about like gambling in general and online betting. I know you said in your story that the track used to be the only place you could really gamble
Yeah.
until you said the 80s, I believe.
Yeah.
But nowadays people don't actually have to go to the track. They don't have to even watch the race at all, even, or they can, like, every sports on TV now is just full of betting ads.
Yeah.
How can how can you know the harness racing and those tracks kind of draw people back into to betting on harness racing as opposed to other sports or other methods of betting on harness racing?
Well, yeah, like that's kind of the thing. Like I think you have to borrow a page from their book. Like there's so many props you can make for harness racing that we just don't do. And they have been tried. Like there's been a few instances of tracks trying these things. But like you could do head to head horse versus horse, which we have tried. Head to head driver versus driver. How fast will this race be? Over under number of wins for a particular driver in the card. Um, how fast will the quarter mile be? And you could even do silly ones, like ones that people can't predict, like the Gatorade colored the Super Bowl. You can be like, will the winner be um a brown horse or a bay horse, or a gray horse? And it's like, obviously you can use handicapping your horses to deduce that, but I mean, you can even be like, will there be more odd or even winners over the course of the card? Horses with odd or even numbers. And I think that's a thing. And also, there needs to be more general advertising. Like, I don't think people care to bet on horse racing that much because A, they don't know much about it, and B, like, it's not really in their frame of mind. Like, people say, like, oh, I'm going to bet on the hockey tonight, but people aren't going to say, I'm going to bet on the card at Mohawk tonight unless you're already in the harness racing circle. So I think more advertising in the mainstream is also necessary. And then you also need to improve the betting product, the amount of things that people have to wager on, and also the rewards. Like in Canada, HPI bets rewards, and I might get in trouble for saying this, but HPI bets rewards are like awful. Like it's literally just collect points. Like it's the PC Optimum points at the superstore. Like there's nothing else. Um, And so I think, wagering in Canada, there's so much more you could do with it.
And I'm sure you could spend a long time answering this question, but I'll give you if you snap your fingers and have one thing change about the sport to change it for the better, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it counts like my idea of changing it into more of a team spectator sport is one thing, but obviously that's what I would do. But if I had to change one thing right now, apart from obviously like, you know, billions of dollars in additional funding, um, it would probably be um, probably maybe to increase those betting options. Like I think even for people within the industry, I think you could get a lot more dollars from them by, making it more interesting to bet on. Like there's been just the standard bets from since the 70s and 80s. We've added more, like the superfecta or pick five or whatever. But I mean, we have not modernized at all in the past 20 years, I would say. There's been some interesting things, but they're all such classic horse racing things that have just been changed a little bit. I think when you implement prop betting and things like that, I would say that would be the one change I would make right now among like that's like, you know, number 1 and down to 20, down to number 20 on my list is like, things that are very close together. Like there are very things that are very similar importance that I would also change. And maybe that's not my number one, but that's the first thing that comes to mind is just, right now, the reality is we're a product that is dependent on betting and the betting options are lacking. And I think if we improve our betting platform, improve the product and improve the rewards system, which if you've ever been on a betting site, they give you boost. And my dad talks about it all the time. He comes in my room, hey Nick, look at this boost I bet on the score. And it's like, we don't have any of that. So I think if you introduce these parlays, these props, and then you add boosts and you advertise it, that is the biggest change I think we could make in the short term.
There's been a lot of hard truths on this show and a lot of things that aren't very exciting. But let's have a bit of fun to end the show here.
All right.
Let's do a quick rapid fire round to end us off here.
All right.
First thing, favorite harness racing memory. Start with an easy one.
Um, dang, there's a couple, but I have to say the one that first pops into my mind is Sand Pail's 2011 British Crown Open Trot win. That's the race I was referring to before, where you even at the Queen's Plate you might not hear it that loud. Like that's how hyped you were for this horse. And I was a part of the posse. I knew the owner. We called it the Pale Posse. I was a part of the posse. I knew the owners. I was in the winner's circle. So that's got to be a top memory for me.
Number two, you've written tons of stories over the years already, harness racing and otherwise, but which one other than the thesis are you most proud of?
Damn, that's a good one. I don't know if I can think of one off the top of my head. I mean, my first story was really cool to see in print. That was a cool one. Um, I think I did a great feature on a baseball player who became a harness racing driver and won his first ever race a couple months ago. And so that was one I was really proud of. And yeah, I guess I'd go with probably those two at the moment.
And of all the tracks you've been to, which one is your favorite?
Oh, I might catch a bit of flack for this, but for harness racing, I gotta say the Meadowlands. I mean, the new Meadowlands is amazing, and it's a really cool facility. It's not something you think of when you think horse racing because it looks so modern. My home track is obviously Mohawk, and there's no place like Mohawk for me. But I gotta say my favorite track to visit is probably the Meadowlands.
And what about one track you've never been to anywhere in the world that you'd like to go to? What's on your bucket list?
Oh well, there's tons in Europe and down under that I'd love to visit. But in terms, I'll keep it in North America. Uh, I would probably say, dang, this is a tough one. Actually, I've been to a lot of the the bigger tracks. You know what? I will say I'd love to go to Vincennes in France. I'll say that for maybe one of their big race days, like the Prix d'Amérique, in France, in Paris Vincennes would be cool.
And last one for you, dream interview in the industry. If you could sit down with anyone, past or present, who would it be and why?
Oh, probably John Campbell. He's our Wayne Gretzky. It's like he's probably he's the undisputed GOAT in most people's minds. So I'll go with John Campbell.
Well, Nick, I appreciate your time. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, my friend, and appreciate it.
Was an absolute pleasure, Ben. Thanks so much for having me on, and you do some great work over there at True North. Always look forward to the newest newsletter.
Thanks again to Nick for joining the show, and thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to check out past episodes of the show and read Nick's in-depth thesis on the subject, which will be linked in the description below this podcast. If you enjoyed the show and want to be the first to listen to future episodes and read all of my written content, subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts or at truenorthsports.substack.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at truenorth_sport and on Instagram and TikTok at truenorthsport. I've been your host, Benedict Rhodes, and thank you so much for listening.